How do we recover from the subtle indoctrination that we've all gone through and the socialization process that we've all endured, that we've gone through from birth until now? How do we recover from that? Basically, how do we spiritually recover so that we can see the world for the first time as it truly is? Because all of this subtle indoctrination and socialization process trains us in duality and trains us to have a dualistic mind, which is a type of illusion and hypnosis that we've all gone through from birth until the present moment in your life. And so how do we recover spiritually from that? Now I'm going to speak to you about 4 subtle aspects of that indoctrination that many people don't speak about or are unaware of. The first one I want to speak to you about is individualism, but specifically hyper-individualism, right? And so we live in a world now where individualism is praised over collectivism, and it's important to define your identity as an individual in a very exaggerated way where you are completely disconnected from the world around you, right? And so, first of all, this type of cognitive style actually is a Western cognitive style, because if we look at the differences between the East and the West, in the East, they developed cultures that were more geared towards rice cultivation, and they needed more group activities, because when you think about rice cultivation, for example, you need a lot of people to do that activity. And so there was much more a need for collectivism in those type of societies. And then basically their traditions and spiritual philosophies reflect that mentality. That's why they have more of a sense of holism. That's why if you look at Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism in general, are more holistic traditions. And so it wasn't really what was good for me, it was what was good for the totality. Now, if we contrast that to the Western cognitive style, which came from Greece, a lot more of the activities were individualistic based. So hunting, herding, and fishing, for example, you could all do on your own. And this kind of developed a cognitive style within Europe that became sort of the Western cognitive style, which is more individualistic. And so the Westerner, as a result, lives more in the prefrontal cortex, and so is more rational, and as a result is more individualistic. And the Easterner lives more in the kind of unconscious regions of the brain, not that they don't obviously apply their prefrontal cortex, they obviously do, but it's not overly employed, right? And so you want to essentially have a good balance between both cognitive styles, not one more than the other. But unfortunately in the world, we are promoting, especially through social media, a type of hyper-individualism, which then leads to what Hans-Georg Maueller and Paul D'Ambrosio coin as profilicity. So you even have an extended individualism. So you have these profiles that you portray in this sort of fake world, this online world, to show who you are and what you think and so forth and so on. And then you actually meet the person in real life and they don't match up to the profile, right? And so what you have as a result is a completely empty state of consciousness, right? Especially when you're talking about profilicity, like you're just portraying a self-image of what you want people to think of you, right? So you are hostage to the perceptions of other people and you are not authentically being yourself. Now, that is a sad type of emptiness that many people live in. And this is a result of profilicity, which goes back to individualism. This idea that you are completely free and you have autonomy and you don't need the world around you, right? And so that reminds me of a great book by Korean German philosopher Byung-Chul Han, The Burnout Society, where he kind of mentions how we willingly exploit ourselves. And this results from this type of autonomy that we think we have in the world. And so we think we are the master, but we essentially become a slave at the hands of our own doing. So let me read this brief quote from the Burnout Society for you. The reaction to a life that has become bare and radically fleeting occurs as hyperactivity, hysterical work, and production. The acceleration of contemporary life also plays a role in this lack of being. The society of laboring and achievement is not a free society. It generates new constraints. Ultimately, the dialectic of master and slave does not yield a society where everyone is free and capable of leisure too. Rather, it leads to a society of work in which the master himself has become a laboring slave. In this society of compulsion, everyone carries a work camp inside. This labor camp is defined by the fact that one is simultaneously prisoner and guard, victim and perpetrator. One exploits oneself. It means that exploitation is possible even without domination. What a beautiful quote by Byung-Chul Han. And isn't it amazing, this idea of self-exploitation that comes from this sense of autonomy? Now, when we think about autonomy in the world, right, we associate so much to the work that we do, right? And so we are obsessed with the work that we do. We actually build our whole personality and we develop this illusory role based on the work that we do. We curate a self-image to perpetuate that. And this is all the result of the Protestant work ethic, which I'll speak at length about in future content. But the Protestant work ethic is basically the work ethic that you see in the world, right? Which drives the American dream and drives entrepreneurs and this and that. This is the Protestant work ethic at the expense of idleness and leisure, right? So ancient cultures had a respect and an understanding that leisure and idleness are very important, but that is being diminished because of this radical hyper-individualism where we are enhancing this type of Protestant work ethic where the one who works the hardest is going to make the most money and this and that, and then you end up with fool's gold and you are more unhappy than when you first started the endeavor itself. So in getting back to what Byung-Chul Han was saying, so this autonomy drives this type of Protestant work ethic because we identify with the work we do and we think work is the be-all and end-all, then we begin to exploit ourselves, right? And this is predominant within social media, right? So social media, we are both the master and the slave when someone is involved with social media. And so this is a subtle thing many people don't think about, right? And so this is unfortunately what is happening to the youth is they are brought up into this world of self-exploitation and they think it is very normal. They may go out with their friends and then they're eager to get home and write a post about it on Facebook, right? And they're 10 years old. This is a disaster, a complete disaster. This is self-exploitation. And we are promoting self-exploitation where we don't need an authoritarian figure anymore to be afraid of who is exploiting us. We are the authoritarian figure exploiting ourselves. We are willingly doing this. And this is one of the problems with individualism. And so as a result of this hyper-individualism, it's hard for us to connect with the greater totality of the world around us, right? We are constantly obsessed with ourselves. We are self-interested. And then so we have less empathy and we feel less for other people, right? And it's a stark contrast to how cultures developed in the East. And if you want a good example of that, you only have to think of the Bhagavad Gita, and I highly recommend the Swami Nikhilananda translation over and above any other translation. But when you read the Bhagavad Gita, there's a constant focus on the downregulation of your ego to fulfill whatever your dharma is, whatever your social function or your innate nature is in the society. And so you are constantly giving yourself away for the greater totality. Now that is obviously not a concept that is well liked in a hyper-individualistic society, nor on social media, right? So that's something for you to think about. That subtle individualism that has infiltrated your life is clouding your thinking, which is clouding your ability to see the non-dual reality of existence, because you're constantly looking at it through your own subjective lens, because after all, the individual is everything according to this perspective, and it is an incorrect perspective. Now, this brings me to the second aspect of these four aspects that kind of eclipse the nature of reality and are necessary to dive into to recover spiritually so that you can see the nature of reality is rationalism. Obviously, individual and rationalism go hand in hand, right? Since we've gone through the Enlightenment period in Europe, rationalism has been on an uphill trend and has infiltrated many other cultures in the world to their own detriment, not even to just the detriment of the Western society in general, but other societies around the world, to their own detriment, right? So you have this hyper-rationalism. Everything is thrown through a rationalistic lens, right? And When we study Eastern philosophy specifically, they are not rational at all. It's almost anti-rational. It's completely irrational, right? And one example of that is the classic fish in the water Zhuangzi story, the happy fish story, where Zhuangzi and his friend are walking over a bridge and they see some fish swimming in the water, circling each other and doing this. And Zhuangzi says, well, the fish are happy today. And then his friend goes, how do you know the fish are happy? And then Zhuangzi says, how do you know that I don't know that the fish are happy? And there's this type of infinite regression, right? Where his friend was operating from a rational view, where he's not actually just sensing how the world actually is. You know when you see a couple of dogs playing that they are happy. You don't have to overly rationalize whether they're happy, right? And this is the point of the Zhuangzi story, is that once we step into that field of hyper-rationality, we're caught in just analysis and the analytical side of our mind, the prefrontal cortex. And so we're not actually seeing the world intuitively from sort of this larger portion of our brain, where we have these intuitions of the world that we didn't have to be trained to think in that way, right? You kind of just know that the dog is happy. You know that the fishes are happy. You don't have to overanalyze it. And this, unfortunately, is what has become of the world. We've become a hyper-rational world where we bake and fry every idea and thing that we see. We scrutinize and analyze. We look right into it, and we miss the point altogether of most of the things that we are trying to understand. Where if we're Zhuangzi's mentality, we are sitting back and we can take in the whole picture, not just the foreground, but we can take in the background, right? Whereas hyper-rationality and individualism is always focusing on the foreground rather than seeing the whole picture. And so this is a big problem in the modern world, this type of rationality, especially because when you have this hyper-rationality, it's hard for you to understand the divine because you're always trying to analyze what this spiritual knowledge is, and you're always reverting back to some rational template and judging whatever philosophy you're reading according to that rational template, no matter whether that's science or something else, which I'll get into later. But nevertheless, with this rationalism and in speaking about the divine, this leads into the third aspect as to why we can't see the world as it truly is and what we need to understand to go through this type of spiritual recovery, and that's atheistic thinking, right? So atheism has kind of consumed the world at a very subtle level. Even people who say they are spiritual, in the end, lean more to atheism, and they don't really trust the world, because you see a person's genuineness of spirituality when you see their trust in action. If you see that they have no trust or no faith in general, then they're obviously an atheist at heart. Spirituality for them is basically a mask that they wear to try and portray a type of sense of the divine, but really they are adherents of atheism. And so this atheistic thinking is in many cultures around the world now because of rationalism and individualism, right? You lose a sense of the totality and you take yourself too seriously because you become too self-obsessed and self-interested. And so your view of the world is that surely there's no God, because have a look at the world based on your own subjective opinion, right? You think that there's something wrong with the world based on your own subjective opinion, but you haven't been everywhere in the world. Your world, so to speak, is what you see online and the immediate environment that you find yourself in. But is that the totality of the world? No, it's not. It's just your subjective view of the world, and you make this weak assumption that there's something wrong with the world. And so you basically then say, well, how can there be a God? Even though many great things happen in the world, but you don't hear about that on the news, right? You only hear about the bad things in the news. So then you make this assumption that there's something rotten in the world, and there's not. But as a result, according to your narrow view of the world, that there can be no sense of the divine, no God, so to speak. But what you don't realize is you yourself are following your own mythology. You're following the mythology that there is no God. So in turn, you cannot prove that there is no God, as you cannot prove that there is a God, if you're talking about from a scientific perspective, right? Either or you cannot prove, but you're comfortable in this not believing, right? And you don't trust your own intuition, you have no trust because you think the world is rotten and it is not. And so this leads into the fourth and last aspect of spiritual recovery to see the divine, is that many people have no sense of the divine and everything is framed through a scientific approach. And that is one of the biggest problems in the world. When people talk about spirituality, they begin to frame through some sort of scientific lens to try and prove if it exists. Even you'll see gurus who will use science to back up their point. And it's like, why do you always lean on science to try and prove your point? Science is its own dogma. And that's what a lot of people don't think about. Science is its own dogma. And you're using science, which is an ever-evolving practice, to try and validate your sense of the divine. This is a silly approach. And all you're doing is seeking validation from the scientific community. And these type of gurus, I feel, are trying to just seek validation from the scientific community so that they can rub shoulders with certain scientists and be in front of certain crowds. But there's nothing wrong with following your spiritual tradition as it is. You don't have to feel guilty for it. You don't need science to prove it. Because why would you need another dogma to prove the validity of the ultimate reality? And after all, a lot of science is based on that materialism is the only reality, right? Materialism is the only reality. This is part of the scientific dogma. We must be able to quantify it. We must be able to measure it. We must be able to see it. There has to be some type of proof to prove something in the scientific endeavor. And so there's an obvious bias towards tangible evidence as opposed to our natural intuitions of the world. We neglect our natural intuitions because we want tangible evidence for everything. And so we neglect the irrational part of ourself. As I mentioned with Chuang-Tzu, right? We're just hyper-rational and we think that there's no validity in intuition, there's no validity in the unconscious regions of the brain, and there's no validity in irrationality. But there is. But there really is. And so when you're thinking about spirituality, if you're thinking about it in the sense through the lens of the scientific materialistic dogma, then you're thinking about spirituality in the wrong way. But everyone has been kind of subtly affected by this scientific dogma, particularly since the early 1900s. Most of us have gone through this indoctrination of the scientific dogmatic approach, but no one is cognizant of it. So we begin to frame everything through that. And you might find yourself subtly doing that, right? Where you might read a text and then you think, well, is that really true? So then you try and back it up with maybe a claim by quantum physics or physics in general, or materialist science or biology, and you're looking for answers in these realms, but you're not giving space for the spiritual sphere. And so you're still consumed by that type of thinking. And so this materialism begins to infect spirituality in general, this scientific materialism, this way of thinking. So when we go from individualism to rationalism to atheistic thinking to the dogma of science and materialism, is that those four aspects and those four subtle elements of indoctrination that we've all gone through are what affect our perspective of spirituality in general, and is why the sense of the divine is eclipsed, because we're constantly thinking through a materialistic lens, a dualistic lens, right? And so we have to realize that a lot of spirituality these days has been hijacked by this type of materialism. And this is basically what New Age spirituality is, right? New Age spirituality is basically over-sensationalized Eastern philosophy, which is basically based on materialism and not based on actually the Eastern philosophical and spiritual teachings. It's just an exaggeration of those teachings to appease the individualism within us, right? New Age spirituality is often about individualism rather than collectivism, rather than really understanding the true nature of reality. And so it's affected by materialism, and it's affected by also a type of atheistic thinking, rationalism, and individualism. And so that's why when people look out at spirituality in this day and age, people who are trying to get introduced to it, a lot of people come across this type of New Age spirituality, and it's completely illogical. It's based on materialism, like I said, it's based on individualism. It's actually not based on non-duality, on the totality of being. It's not based on a type of holistic thinking. It's still based on the limited individual. And so they are trying to appease that. And it's no surprise that when we look at New Age spirituality, it's very commercial and about making money in the end of the day. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people fall for New Age spirituality and then they find themselves no better than when they embarked on that endeavor, because it's still involved in materialism. You are still involved in materialism and you haven't broke that shell of that type of individualistic, self-interested perspective. So all you're doing is doubling down on your self-obsession, but what you've done is you've put on this spiritual mask, and then that becomes your new identity. So in saying all that, you're probably asking, what can we do about this? And it's very simple to recover from these four aspects that are at the heart of socialization and the indoctrination process. And that is a return to traditionalism and the ways of the ancients. I actually speak a lot about that in my book, Spiritual Freedom in the Digital Age, about this return to the ways of the ancients. And not just that, we need to actually return to traditionalism. Now, not New Age spirituality, right? New Age spirituality is based on materialism in its essence. And I know a lot of people who follow New Age spirituality will disagree with me there because they're not cognizant of it, or they don't want to believe that that's the fact, but that is the fact. And so we need to move back to the actual traditional knowledge and the traditions themselves, because when we talk about Eastern philosophy and spirituality, it's the traditions that imbue the philosophies with the spirit of the divine. And so when we talk about Vedanta, when we talk about Taoism, Vajrayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, yoga, any tradition you can think of, you have to revert to the tradition. Because if you don't, it ends up being what yoga is in the West. You know, a lot of people in the West think yoga is just asanas, but yoga is a rich philosophical tradition that has been completely destroyed because of the cultural and traditional appropriation that these traditions have gone through in the West. Because a mentality of individualism is to look at traditions and not say, how will this enlighten me? But people come to it and said, how will this help me in a self-interested way? It's not about enlightenment, it's about how it can improve themselves. Or they may ascribe healing to it, right? A lot of New Age spirituality is about healing, which I'll make content about that in the future. But you have all of these ideas ascribed to these traditions, but they've just gone through this cultural and traditional appropriation to suit the cultural sensitivities of certain cultures around the world, let's say Western cultures, right? And so they try to adapt it to their culture, where you are missing the gold in the tradition, right? And this is why you need to follow traditions to the nth degree, because it will transform your life. It won't cater to your personality and your individuality. It will pull the rug from underneath you and leave you buck naked. That's the whole point of these traditions. And so that's why we need to revert back to that and the ways of the ancients, right? What does the ways of the ancients mean here? Well, it means by following the traditions, right? Following them to the nth degree, but also in the way that you conduct yourself in life, reverting back to what life was just 15 years ago. Imagine that, right? Not so much time on the phone, not so much time on social media, go out gardening, speak to people face to face, do things with your hands, read actual books, eat without the television on, so forth and so on, right? Revert back to the ways of the ancients. Live a real life, because a real life is a deep life, right? This life where you're on the phone, you're on social media, you're exploiting yourself, this is the surface. This is the real surface. If you want to understand the real marrow of life, you need to move that all away. And you need to align more with idleness, with embracing leisure, right? Things that are not embraced in the modern world. Idleness just 50 years ago was very high in the world, because all you could do a lot of the time was be idle. So all you would do is look out the window and look at a bird and a tree, and it was fantastic. But now we're looking out the bird in the tree and we've got a podcast on in the ear. Or we go for a walk, we've got these things in. This is a complete disaster. And this will not bring you closer to the divine and will continue to eclipse the true nature of reality. How can you ever understand that oneness is the true reality if you've always got your earplugs in, if you're always thinking and ruminating, if any moment of spare time you're constantly filling in that space? You need to have space in your life. Your mind needs space. It yearns for space. Its nature is space. But you're constantly filling up this empty void full of noise, which distracts you and eclipses the fundamental nature of reality. And so you must revert back to the way of the ancients and follow the traditions themselves and love it and enjoy it. That's what it's all about. Personally, I love the traditions. I love going to even the locations where some of the sages and gurus and that have gone, because why not go there, right? People will say to me, what do you go to these places for? And then I ask them, why do you watch Netflix all night? And why do you go to Disneyland? So do you see? You need to have a different orientation. What is your priority in life, right? Is your priority spirituality and the divine? Or is your priority being a non-dual police officer online, but you continually enact all these dualistic tendencies where you're at Disneyland, where you're watching Netflix all day, where you're online arguing with people in the comment section or trying to flex to show how smart you are or how profound you are, which is a dead giveaway that you are neither. And so that's something for all of us to think about, right? That's something for all of us to think about. How much are you really dedicated to this? Are you really dedicated to a type of spiritual recovery so that you can truly see the divine? Or have you fully invested in those four aspects that I mentioned: individualism, rationalism, atheistic thinking, and framing everything through the scientific approach, and so you have no sense of the divine? These four need to be down-regulated and eliminated, in a sense, almost altogether for you to understand the true nature of the divine. And so that requires us to have an enthusiasm and a passion for the spiritual traditions, for that knowledge, a love for that knowledge. Just like you love your spouse, just like you love your dog, like you love your kids, you need to have that love for this knowledge, for the divine. Otherwise, you will not go too far on the path. And what will enhance that is a return to the way of the ancients, a return to simplicity, a return to sanity. Shanti, shanti, shanti.